Gesine Weber, thank you very much for being a guest today.
Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure.
So I'm going to begin with my Inside the Actor Studio questionnaire. What is your favorite word?
That's a tough one, especially as I'm fluent in four languages. But I think I will pick maybe a French one here, which is retrouvailles. And it explains the pleasure of coming together after a long time. It describes a very friendly, a very vivid, and a very optimistic atmosphere. And I just like this idea of coming back together after a long time and having the joy of finding people again.
Nice. What is your least favorite word?
Oh, that's a hard one. Um, I would have to think about that, I have to say.
What is your favorite curse word in any language?
Oh, I actually don't use one very often, but my French friends will know that I've been using the word putain in French quite a lot, which is a very versatile word to swear when. But French people use it all the time. If they are surprised, they use it. If they are happy or astonished, they use it. So I think that is a good all-rounder.
I mean, my next one is going to be has world affairs recently caused you to use it much?
No, actually not.
What is a sound or noise that you love?
I have to say, I really like the sound of the first birds in the morning, simply because I'm a morning person and there's nothing like getting up and you're somewhere between the morning silence and having the sound of birds.
What is a sound or noise that you hate?
Simply too much city noise and basically fire brigades. It's good that they are coming, but I just find it too loud and too disturbing.
The a weird thing I have is that I love the sounds of sirens in Europe because it somehow makes me feel more cosmopolitan when I hear this
Hmm.
because they're so different from British ones.
Oh
But
yeah, I can see that.
yeah, uh, do you have any guilty pleasures?
Oh, many. I think the most important guilty pleasure is the matcha latte to go in the morning, ideally accompanied by a nice cookie or a good banana bread.
What is your favorite book?
That's a hard one, but I think Mornings in Janine by Susan Abulhawa is certainly among the top ones because it tells basically the story of the conflict between Israel and Palestine, but tells it as the history of an individual family, where every major event of the conflict is tied to a major tragedy in the family.
And finally, are there any fictional characters who you'd like to imagine yourself to be?
Not really. I prefer nonfiction over fiction.
So I've always been fascinated by foreign affairs and international relations since I was a weird little kid. Uh, so I'm always curious about how other people got into it. What was your journey?
Well, I think I was maybe also one of the weird little kids that were interested in the big question of world affairs and especially in Europe when they grew up. I personally grew up on the German countryside in a village with 250 people, not really any contacts with Europe or the outside world. So for me, I think the way I found my path into foreign affairs and basically international politics and European affairs were languages, because I was a bit hyperactive as a kid and decided that learning languages was a great tool. And as soon as you learn a language, you're discovering a new world that lies behind that. But at one point, I realized that I don't want to be the person who just translates, that I want to be the person who kind of explains what is happening there. And that is how I think I arrived in foreign affairs and also European affairs. And when you grow up at the time of the Euro crisis, of Arab Spring, then you quickly end up looking into the broader security questions and strategic implications.
Something I've always found unusual is being a gay man interested in like war and foreign policy and grand strategy. Um, like the for a long time until it's changed more recently, but for a long time there would only be like say the historian Michael Howard, who was like a an example of a gay man who was in that world. So I'm also curious about what have you found being a woman in that space?
Yeah, to be honest, it's tough. And I mean, I'm already speaking from a very privileged position in this regard, because there's an entire generation of women before me who are now in their 50s or so, who really had to break the glass ceiling. And although this glass ceiling is still there, it is much thinner for people like me now than it is today. But especially if you're a young woman in the field, sexism is extremely present. It happened to me that I was the speaker, for example, at a conference, and I was the one on a panel just checking in, and the participant, male participant, who was like 30 years older to me, just handed me his jacket because he had asked me to kindly bring it to the cloakroom until I told him that I'd be the speaker and that I'd see him in the audience. So that is something that happens all the time, or that you get comments why someone who kind of is young and female is in general interested in that. But I mean, the cliches are sitting so deep. I also had high school teachers who said that maybe one had to paint the tanks pink so that women get interested in that. And there are a lot of persistent cliches in the field, but the best is just to tackle them, to play with them, and to maybe just demonstrate that not all of them are correct.
I mean, I sort of laughed grimly when I saw a comment of yours on Blue Sky about men sliding into your DMs after you publish big, serious geopolitical analysis.
Oh yeah, God, that happens all the time. When I still had my Twitter account, I often wrote, Twitter isn't Tinder, but the same goes for Blue Sky isn't Bumble, and LinkedIn isn't The League. So it is always fascinating. Like sometimes you're getting a lot of kind of constructive feedback, or you're of course also getting emails from people who just were like, hey, that was good, or also I don't agree with you. But honestly, you don't go on TV if you want to if you're commenting on something, or you don't go on podcasts, or you don't publish because you're looking for a partner. So this is basically not the main endeavor of that. And I'm always impressed that some people see that as kind of the bridge that they can use to kind of initiate a flirt or so.
Something I've always gone back and forth on is whether there's such a thing as grand strategy. I used to be very firmly of the view that there was, and then I felt that there wasn't, and now I'm kind of in the middle, which is why I was so interested in reading sort of your writing on grand strategy. So I'm curious about what's your view?
So I would say it is hard to say whether there is grand strategy or whether there is no grand strategy. I would say there is certainly the concept and the theory of grand strategy. And then there is the reality of grand strategy. So in general, when we refer to the strategy or grand strategy, we think about an encompassing approach, I would say, that links ends, meaning objectives, something that a state wants to achieve, that it sees kind of as its end goal, to means, meaning instruments, and then also defines the ways, how precisely these means are supposed to be employed to achieve the ends. So that in general is grand strategy, and then you will look at different domains and different resources that can be used for that. Looking, for example, of course, at a military domain, looking at the importance of the economic domain, and also thinking how, for example, all this can be underpinned by public opinion, or how we can bring the public on board. So in theory, there is certainly something as grand strategy. In practice, it really depends what you're looking at. Because there are also ideal types of grand strategy. So, for example, one could imagine a grand strategy that is more restrained, that would focus on only security and prosperity as major objectives. One could think about, let's say, a liberal internationalist grand strategy, which also emphasizes, for example, the importance of democracy promotion. And then the question is how this is going to be implemented. Over years, I would say that maybe the United States have been a country that had at least, I would say, a guiding line in terms of grand strategy. For many European states, it looks a bit different because many of them often defined their actual strategy or their role in the world also as a function of the transatlantic alliance, and thereby often followed US strategy. And then, of course, there are also actors like China, where grand strategy, for example, also follows other schools of thinking in international affairs, and where, for example, also elements of it is called moral realism, for example. So kind of blending this idea of leading by example also into the debate plays a role. So basically, I wouldn't say that there is one such thing as grand strategy. There are many, many shades and nuances of grand strategy. And it really depends on how states implement it.
Several years ago, I had a discussion with Peter Ricketts, the former national security advisor to Britain. And we had a back and forth over his sort of general belief that strategy is sort of a lot of careful, deliberate planning far in advance towards an ultimate objective. And his sort of argument was that politicians can't do strategy. And therefore, implicitly, it's up to officials to do that sort of more long-term thinking and planning and strategizing, and politicians need to buy into it. And my sort of counter was that politicians are actually, or can be actually, very good strategists because they have an end goal in mind, which is win the next election. And they all can be very good at seizing day-to-day events towards achieving that objective. Where they struggle is translating that skill to foreign policy and national security. And so that kind of fed into my view of strategy is almost like a spectrum. And on the one end is the sort of long-term planning, careful considerations. And then on the other is that strategy is more iterative and reactive and dynamic. It's sort of alive, and you can't necessarily write it all down in a document that can apply for 5, 10, 15, 20 years in the future.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that, and maybe add some nuances to that. So I think there is, of course, kind of this idea of grand strategy, which spans over at least 1 decade, potentially more. And when engaging in grand strategy, a very important part of that is to imagine the world how you want it to be and how you're getting there. And basically about the goals and the objectives that you want to achieve and potentially also defend. So this is really this long-term exercise, whereas also the other thing I would say is almost electoral tactics or like a more short-term strategy. And I mean, there as well, the term of strategy with linking ends to means is certainly to some extent the same. If one says, okay, my objective is I want to be re-elected next year. So the means to get there is to adapt my decisions in a way that I anticipate will please the public and also secure votes. So I would say the basic mechanism is probably the same, but what's very different is the time horizon here. And I think indeed that for some politicians, this exercise of grand strategy can be extremely challenging, simply because you need this 10,000 foot perspective. And you really need to be willing to look not only to the next elections, but beyond that. And I think, therefore, that politicians who have, let's say, a limitation in their mandate, or maybe also not necessarily mechanisms like elections that can potentially threaten their political future, are potentially even in a better position to do grand strategy from a very geopolitical perspective, because these domestic factors will matter less for them. But nonetheless, I think in the end, it comes down also to political courage, because you could also be very well aware that, let's say, a measure might not be a popular one among public at the very moment, but might potentially benefit your country on the long term.
That kind of touches on a fascination of mine and a frustration with the Starmer government, which is it seems to have a theory of grand strategy. You sort of listed on it on in a recent article of keeping in with America to an extent, um, keeping in with Europe to an extent, somehow balancing those two against each other with outside trade deals and things like that to ameliorate not choosing one or the other outright. But then also, I saw one criticism of the EU UK trade deal of like, given the hostility of sort of the right wing press in Britain to what is actually a very mild deal, why not just be more politically courageous and go for something bigger? Because you would get criticized either way. So why not just go bigger and achieve other objectives like economic growth?
That brings us back to this first question that we discussed, basically the pressure from domestic groups and domestic developments. So I think there might potentially have been room to go bolder, bigger on the recent EU-UK deal. It's not an ambitious framework. I think it is really what could be achieved at the very moment. It's good that the security and defense partnership is there, and it's good that one will talk about youth mobility and all that. But more could have been done. And I think there is, of course, also this domestic pressure in the UK that Starmer has to strike the balance between getting closer to Europe, simply because, especially at a time where transatlantic relations and also the special relationship looks a bit shaky, it's good not to be out all alone in the rain as an island, because in the end, you cannot escape geography, and geographically, the UK just is in Europe. So having these closer ties with the EU certainly makes sense, especially when it comes to security and defense. But on the other hand, people also do not want to rejoin the European Union, or at least voted against. So he has to find a balance between the two of them, and that is also how I would explain that.
My sort of opinion on grand strategy started to shift, of like whether it does exist or doesn't exist, and whether it can be done, or start to shift through a combination of Ukraine and the return of Trump, in the sense of the collective, if uncoordinated, reaction of Europeans to both those things. And it kind of seemed like maybe for the first time in a long time, Europeans, and I'm including sort of Britain in that, were starting to think more grand strategically than they had maybe for a very long time.
Yeah, I would agree to that, simply because for quite a long time, Europeans didn't have to think in terms of grand strategy when you're really going back to this idea of looking at global order, looking at maybe alliances that shift, looking at partnerships, structures of cooperation, of conflict, and so on. Simply because most military interactions Europeans were involved in were crisis management. And it was not directly affecting like the geography, for example, of Europe. And also, there was much more cohesion in the alliance that the Europeans are part of, namely NATO, when it came to, for example, addressing crisis management. I don't say that this was unproblematic when we think, for example, about Iraq, but the alliance as such was never openly questioned. And now there is basically a US president who did precisely that, and that prompts Europeans to completely go back to the basics, basically, of international relations, and also adapting their strategy to a world where they just cannot take certain things for granted, or at least have to reflect on a world where one cannot take certain things for granted, as, for example, alliances. And this entire question of how, for example, the US adapts its approach to the world, adapts its approach to Russia, to China, will have a massive impact on Europeans, which at the same time are facing a massive territorial threat from Russia, which wasn't perceived as such over quite a long time, especially in the more Western or Southern European states. So there are different factors now coming together that have altered the balance of threat in Europe, and where many Europeans also have the perception the global balance of power is changing.
I do sometimes feel sympathetic for European leaders right now, in the sense of it's sort of, are things really changing or are they not changing? In the sense of, Trump came in January, and over the course of January, February, March, he and his administration went hard on Europe. Lots of Euro bashing. The alliance is over. Europe needs to look after itself. Yada yada yada. And there was this sort of collective mortification. When I spoke to Christina Kafara, she compared the Zelensky Oval Office meeting to, obviously not in terms of scale, but sort of a 9/11 moment, in the sense of this very public, very searing image that signaled a changed world, and everyone sort of knows where they were when they discovered the Zelensky Oval Office meeting and everything like that. And then since then, especially since the tariffs, it kind of feels like the Trump administration has realized they maybe went too far in the Euro bashing, because they need Europe to counterbalance China. And now there's been a sort of rowing back. So I imagine it can be tempting for some European leaders to think, oh, we don't really need to overhaul the last 60, 70 years of the transatlantic alliance, because Trump's becoming more normal again. So we don't have to put in all this effort and all this political capital and all the sort of controversy that goes with it.
So I think that the panic among European leaders certainly peaked in late February. After we had the start of talks between Russia and the United States, after the Oval Office encounter that you mentioned, and also after the Munich Security Conference speech of US Vice President J.D. Vance. Because even for the most transatlantic or historically transatlanticist states, this speech was really questioning the very basis of what they had traditionally seen as the fundamental idea of the transatlantic relationship, which is values. And even though there had always been conflicts about, or questions and tensions periodically about strategic orientations or policy goals and all that, the most transatlantic countries have always argued that the relationship has this common base of values. And after the Munich Security Conference speech, when you had, on the one hand, these talks with Russia, an openly hostile rhetoric towards Europe, and the risk of Europeans to be excluded from key talks on the European security order, this coupled with the speech was just too much for many Europeans. And I think that is why we saw panic peak at this moment, and why we also saw the launch of a coalition of the willing among European states. So that was really where the concern was probably highest among European leaders. That doesn't mean that concern has vanished since the slightly softer tone towards Europe that we've been seeing over the last maybe 2 weeks. But I would say it is not at the peak anymore. It still remains, the level of concern still remains very high. But we see that there are different strategies, I would say, among Europeans that are emerging. So especially while all Europeans in general share the view that Europe has to do more for European security and defense, and that there is most likely not going to be a back to the 1990s in terms of transatlantic relationship and the US taking care of European security and Europeans free riding. There are some differences with, for example, Poland or the Eastern and Northern European states that are much more focused on the question of how can we get the US involved at any price. And then states, for example, like France, and I would also count the UK in this basket, and potentially also Germany, that say, of course, the US has to stay engaged to a certain degree. But we are aware that Europe is not the US strategic priority and that the United States will pivot away from Europe regardless of what Europeans do. So that basically the European priority should be accompanying that transition and really coming up with a sort of roadmap that allows to reduce the US contribution to European security.
The whole coalition of the willing thing has fascinated me for two reasons. Firstly, I think it was just an offhand comment from Trump about Europe supplying peacekeepers to Ukraine. And I imagine that when Putin heard it, he was mortified. But it's an idea that Starmer and Macron have just ran with ever since Trump casually mentioned it. And it's sort of starting to gather a momentum. And I imagine Putin can't easily tell Trump to nix it because it's his own idea. And then secondly, and this again goes to my agnosticism about grand strategy. I think it was 2019, Jake Sullivan wrote a very interesting essay basically arguing that because of Trump's first presidency, but also a longer trend, international institutions were weakening. Multilateralism didn't really work anymore. Therefore, you needed coalitions of the willing that would come together on an informal basis and solve problems. And that's why during the Trump first term, you would have these countries come together, especially American allies. And then when America returned to its senses, sort of they would come back almost like a Jekyll and Hyde thing, like the sort of suave democratic Jekyll would return after the sort of Hyde of the first Trump administration and resume its seat at the top of the sort of international order. And so the whole coalition of the willing thing has sort of fascinated me now because of Hyde 1 wasn't an aberration. You had Jekyll again, and then you've got Hyde again. So it's like, how do Britain and Europe plan for this continual pendulum from America of Jekyll Hyde, Jekyll Hyde?
So these are two excellent questions, and I have to say coalitions of the willing are so fascinating that you can write your PhD on that, because I wrote mine on minilateral formats of cooperation, so basically mini coalitions of the willing in European security and defense. So you can fill a lot of pages with that. Let me first pick up on the peacekeeping idea before we go a bit in the big picture of that. So actually, it's I wouldn't give Trump credit for the idea because French President Macron has already mentioned that in February 2024. I think in an interview or in a speech or so. And he just talked about deploying European troops to Ukraine potentially. And that sparked substantial outrage among all the European partners. And since then, the idea has actually made a very long way. Last summer, we had a Lithuanian foreign minister who didn't totally exclude that and brought some ambiguity in. And then Trump mentioned this idea of European peacekeepers. And now we are basically at the discussions about a potential, it is called a European reassurance force, meaning that Europeans could, at least according to use the wording of the official communiques, deploy troops in strategic locations. Nobody knows exactly what this is going to be, but it is excluded that this would be the front line of the conflict. It is excluded that this would be to supplement the Ukrainian military. And it is basically written that these are supposed to contribute to deterrence. But nobody knows exactly how this force would be exactly created. Nobody knows exactly which countries would contribute. And nobody knows exactly under which modalities it could be deployed, only that it would only be deployed, and that is one hard condition, in case of a ceasefire. But overall, there are much more questions than answers about that. And I think that is also, of course, part of a negotiation strategy to some extent, to basically signal European willingness. But I think if there was a peacekeeping mission, you would generally need a mandate from the United Nations Security Council for that. And I can hardly imagine a purely European led peacekeeping mission, because these are usually international, and I could rather see other countries that traditionally contribute a lot to these efforts. For example, China, Bangladesh also contribute to that. Looking a bit on the broader picture of and it's not necessarily call it coalitions of the willing, but maybe just intergovernmental cooperation outside existing institutions like the EU, NATO, or the UN. That actually has a long history. So we have seen that particularly in the European context, for example, in armament, procurement, for years, we have seen that as a very famous example with the Iran nuclear deal, where the Europeans played a key role in putting this together. So you had France, Germany, and the UK, the High Representative from the European Union, and then the US, China, and Russia also participating in these negotiations. And quite often these smaller formats of cooperation are there to complement what cannot be done in institutions. Or for the UK, there is, for example, also the case of the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is a grouping of the UK and several northern European states, mostly to enhance operational coordination and cooperation. So they have joint exercises, training, and all that. And that goes beyond of what is being done in existing institutional frameworks. You have it even inside the European Union with the permanent structured cooperation, which allows states that are willing and able to deepen their cooperation, especially when it comes to capabilities. And then we have seen it always also, by the way, under the Biden administration, for example, because these small minilateral formats, especially in the Indo-Pacific, have been extremely important for the administration. There was, on the one hand, an importance to invest more in multilateral fora, again, as you said, but also, for example, the Quad, so a format of the US with partners in the Indo-Pacific, and also the so-called AUKUS deal between the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia, were very important in the regional strategy of the United States. So it's not necessarily an either or. Often it is an and, if you want to put it like that.
Last summer, I ended up, I read, a friend sent me a article by a former Boris Johnson advisor setting out how to end the war in Ukraine. Basically, his general argument was that it should be an armistice like Korea, and there would be a de facto partition of Ukraine, similar to the partition of Korea, and it wouldn't be necessary for either Zelensky or Putin to sign the ceasefire, just like the South Korean president didn't sign the armistice because it was too politically unpopular. And basically, it was essential for Europe and America to do this because they were the biggest losers from the Ukraine war. Because Russia was being so successful in the war, and sort of it was solidifying Russian and Chinese cooperation, and we need to rescue Russia from Chinese dependence. And this article infuriated me for many reasons. And I ended up writing a sort of long riposte, basically arguing that as far as the West is concerned, this war can go as long as Ukraine is willing to fight it, because we and China are the two that most benefit from this war. So there isn't really any need for us to bring it to an end. But let's assume that we did want to bring it to an end. How the peace looks like should reinforce Western values and the Western sense of order. And so I ended up just a rough outline of a deal in which basically allow Putin to get what he wants, but legitimately. And so you would have peacekeepers from neutral countries like Bangladesh, like Brazil, like in India, take over current occupied territories, allow some sort of plebiscite in the Donetsk regions, and then whoever is the winner, and it's seen to be a legitimate vote, would then have control of those territories. And as far as the West is concerned, it would facilitate Ukraine's entry into the EU and NATO either way, because its borders would be settled. So then I was very surprised that sort of at the end of this comes the idea of European peacekeepers going into Ukraine. And I've also kind of felt like, although people like Macron and Starmer say it's part of a ceasefire, I do also wonder if it's actually a very subtle way to continue the war with Europe sustaining, say, Western Ukraine by having a reassurance force there.
So first, I wouldn't say that any European deployment is part of sustaining the war. Because for the moment, at least what we have read about the reassurance force, the idea would really be that it contributes to deterrence and prevents Russia from further attacking Ukraine or attacking Ukraine again. And I also think that in general, one of the key conditions that have always been outlined for a European troop deployment is the existence of a stable and sustainable ceasefire. So I think the temporality here is very important. Because if you have the ceasefire or a peace agreement and you send any force in a country after that, then it is even crystal clearer that if you send it before, that it is a force that is only for deterrence purposes or potentially for training, but not for any kind of aggression also. And I think it's important to underline that when we talk about any kind of peace agreement also, that or basically also who benefits from the from the ongoing war, I think it's crystal clear that the biggest loser of this war is Ukraine, and that therefore also the European efforts really need to be focused on taking into consideration Ukrainian interests and to see how throughout these negotiations and also post potential ceasefire deal, they can ensure that Ukraine gets out of this war as strong as possible and with the best potential to basically recover from this war, to pursue a path into European integration, however that may look like, and also to just be able to defend itself against Russia. And I think that here Europeans are setting already the sails in the good direction with the so-called porcupine strategy. And that is, for example, also included in the EU white paper on defense, and clearly outlines the ongoing military support, so that the idea would be to have Ukraine as a sort of conventional hedgehog that would just not be attacked because it is way too strong.
Finally, I was just going to end on, you wrote a really interesting piece recently about, it was sort of bringing together realism and sort of EU and European grand strategy. And you sort of touched on a tension between the EU as an institution and its leadership, and the European member states, and basically which of these two could best practice a grand strategy, given the sort of the way competencies are delineated and things like that. And I find that really interesting, because something I've wondered with recent news over the last few years is that there's a great, I don't know if you've seen it, but there was a great speech that William Hague gave when he was Shadow Foreign Secretary in about 2008, 2009, when the Lisbon Treaty was being negotiated. And there was the whole discussion of sort of the European Council president. And William Hague gave a very funny speech in the Commons talking about a President Tony Blair. And because Tony Blair's name was being mentioned as a potential, the first European Council president. And so there was a very funny speech. And his underlying point was basically we should be careful about creating a European Council president, because in Britain, the role of Prime Minister evolved from a sort of first among equals coordinating role that didn't have that much power, and then it evolved into this sort of executive powerful institution. And over the last few years, I've been thinking about that speech, and I've always kind of wondered if von der Leyen is almost like a transitory figure, in terms of she seems to have made the European Commission president role, it seems much more significant role both within Europe and outside Europe than her predecessors were.
Okay, so let's start with the role of von der Leyen. I think when she took the presidency first in the Commission presidency first in 2019, she already had this ambition of leading a geopolitical commission. So I think what is interesting in her role as a Commission president is that she, on the one hand, of course, had all these big European questions of economic cooperation, of cohesion of the union, of institutional questions, of climate and all that. But this aspect of the EU as an actor in the world has always been extremely present in her entire vision about Europe, which I would also say is absolutely rightly so, because you cannot think about the EU as the biggest internal market in the world. And you cannot think about questions like the EU as a green power if you do not see that in the international environment that the EU is operating in. But I think that this entire approach to how she sees the European Union, namely not only as a project among European states, but also something that basically goes far beyond that and is really an actor in the world, has clearly benefited the perception of her role as a strong Commission president as well. And I think it is also very visible that she's really speeding up the rhythm of work of the Commission, and that the Commission under her leadership has also become very creative, for example, when it comes to addressing challenges that stem from global trends. We have seen that, for example, during the pandemic and the common debt that the EU took for member states. We have seen that during Russia's war on Ukraine, when, for example, it started using the European Peace Facility, which was originally conceived as a tool for supporting partners in the global south to reimburse member states if they wanted to supply weapons to Ukraine. So we have seen creativity here. And now we also see that the EU is tapping much more in its competence in industrial policy. On the one hand, to respond to the challenges of the green transition, but also already during the Biden era to respond to the Inflation Reduction Act, and now also to some extent to support the European defense industry. So basically what I would say the Commission is now doing under von der Leyen is that the Commission is really playing its role and living up to its competences that it is being given in the Lisbon Treaty. So I would say that that demonstrates on the one hand the necessity of leadership, but on the other hand also how important political will is to tap into these instruments. And maybe also that the European Union has quite some firepower in key areas of policy, on the one hand among member states, but also that it can be a true geopolitical actor if it leverages its potential. That leads us maybe back to your first question. Who could do something like a grand strategy for Europe, member states or the EU? I think that both of that has to go together. We have a ton of good strategic documents, I would say, on the EU level. We had an EU global strategy in 2016. Very bad timing because it was published just a few days after the Brexit referendum. Then there is a strategic compass that is more focused on security and defense. But at the moment, there is no such thing like an updated global strategy or an updated EU grand strategy, which basically says which is the world that the EU wants to see and how can the EU contribute to getting there. And on the national level, we also do not necessarily have that. There are a few documents which are more focused on the security and defense angle. For example, in the UK, this is the integrated review. France has a security strategy. Germany has a security strategy. But there's no such thing like public documents from key European states that are something like a global strategy, like let's say a UK in the world strategy, or I would say a France in the world strategy also. So there is certainly work to do. And if European states do that, that clearly needs to be articulated also with the European Union. The problem here is, I would say, an ambition implementation gap, because even if you had the strategy and the ideas and the definition of the ends and objectives on the EU level, that doesn't help a lot because so much of the implementation happens on a member state level. And if the member states don't buy in into that and really also are willing to implement it, an EU strategy would actually be useless.
Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the state of the world and the trend of things?
I mean, overall, things look rather concerning at the moment. But personally, I would say that I'm an eternal optimist and think that, of course, we will have to face global crisis. And I do not think that they get better. But I want to believe that we are able to come up with good solutions for that.
Gesine Weber, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.